I am Josh Poole. This is Field of Dry Bones, and I'm going to read straight from the beginning of the story. Rain's coming, Ezekiel muttered, adjusting his sunglasses while his cane tapped against an artificial leg. I can feel it. That leg can't feel nothing, Charles replied, sitting across the old porch in an identical rocking chair, his gut hanging over his thighs like a sack of potatoes. Ezekiel had been blind for 3 years, having been out in the fields when the invasion forces began dusting the fields with an organic vapor to change the genetic makeup of many crops and its radius. The initial invasion had been that of forced cooperation, a sort of great leap forward where things were strong-armed to suit their own species' optimal conditions. Ezekiel was out showing his son how to know when the corn was ready to harvest when the first wave of drones flew over. He lost his vision and a leg, but his 12-year-old adopted son began experiencing an odd illness. Exposure to the vapors had caused a series of alterations to his genetic sequence, and before long, his body was eaten up by self-replicating cells until there was nothing left. Gonna be a good rain. Yes, sir, Ezekiel continued. Corn's gonna be just fine. So it's, the story's pretty straightforward, and I think when we go on to ask more about what it is to write suspense, I think these will make more sense. But the story is essentially just about a man, Ezekiel. He's the main character, sitting on a porch with his friend Charles, and talking about an incoming storm on a planet that's in the midst of hostile colonization. Ezekiel's a blind farmer who loses his sight early on in the terraforming process, so we know that the invasion's been going on for 3 years at this point, but we don't really know anything about the invading species or anything, or even what species really the two men are. And in the story, it's unclear because Ezekiel's blind. It's unclear what the rain actually is, and whether or not he's sort of the prototypical blind prophet, or whether he is actually onto something. The story is ostensibly just about an impending doom and how two characters deal with it, but there's a lot of subplots and things going on underneath that. That's a pretty tough one. I think, and forgive me for being bland here, but I think it's in the details. And the issue is, when you're working with short stories, is something that by definition has to be short and sweet, but you have to somehow create vivid worlds and fleshed out characters that are somehow not overwritten or slow and droning on for readers to follow through. And I think the trick to writing compelling short fiction is to just kind of mind your levels of detail. You can't be like Tolkien and go deep into the fictional world, but at the same time you can't just gloss over it. And it's really frustrating because I feel like novels are more forgiving in terms of how deep or shallow you want to be with the plot, whereas with short stories there really is, I think, a sweet spot for short fiction. And I think the best way to get a feel for what that sweet spot is to read successful short fiction, which would be Cathedral or Hills Like White Elephants. You'll see them in any short fiction anthologies, at least here in the United States. So creating suspense is a difficult task. I think the best summary, and I'm going to have to paraphrase here because I don't recall the interview word for word, but Hitchcock described it as like a surprise, like a jump scare, being like a bomb blowing up in a restaurant all of a sudden, whereas suspense is like would be watching that person plant the bomb while the waiter serves the table and the two people go on eating, like they're unaware. That's the suspense, is knowing something that your characters don't know. That's one form of suspense. But I think the key the key pillars of writing suspense would be foreshadowing, having a time-sensitive plot, the race against time. There's a lot of different ways to approach that. You have betrayal. You can have the chase, which always creates a suspense and false resolutions, which is my personal favorite. To have the story feel like it's ending, but then it has, you're at the midpoint, and what's key in all of this is that the characters are fallible, that they can fail. They can, someone can be in the chase scene, your protagonist can fail to get away, and then they have to fight, or the end of the story is them failing, whether that means they die or they just miss their deadline and lose their job. The suspense is all about inconveniences and characters being unable to answer to them, and that's a very human genre, I feel. This is the suspense, and I think the key again is to read successful suspense and to try to acclimate yourself to the genre without emulating any particular author too much. Sure. Let's see, off the top of my head, and it's not really a conventional suspense, I feel, but I think one of the better short stories that I read in the past year is probably Good Old Neon by David Foster Wallace, which follows he's late 20s, early 30s, but he's a yuppie who's just well-adjusted and ostensibly pretty successful, working a stimulating and rewarding job, at least monetarily rewarding, but the character feels trapped by his own inauthentic behavior. And the idea, I think, is that he feels like he's projecting the world of himself through a pinhole, and what everyone else sees is what's on the other side of that pinhole, because he's always acting out. And in the story takes place after the protagonist commits suicide, and is told by his ghost. And it's a very, and I say it's suspense because you know what happens to the character. You can figure it out. It's told in the very beginning that he's going to die, but you don't know the reasons why. And so the suspense is in that. The suspense is where you don't know what the motivations are, what causes this character. And the character goes to therapy, and he has like an ideal therapist, but he's completely ineffectual, and is often described as lacking, I think firepower is the operative word that they use in the story. And it's kind of similar to, the story itself is similar to Nathaniel Hawthorne's Young Goodman Brown. It's about it's like a Puritan story where he sees like an evil in the forest and follows the course of Neil from Good Old Neon, where there's a quote from Young Goodman Brown that goes, "His dying hour was gloom," and so I think there's suspense stories though, and maybe another example would be The Snows of Kilimanjaro by Hemingway, and there's a passage from that about destroying talent by not using it and by betraying yourself, and I feel like that really relates a lot to Good Old Neon as well, and that perhaps influenced it was the idea of accepting one's talents and trying to pursue those versus accepting some social standard and kind of living with the consequences of being a fraud. And the suspense in these stories results from knowing that I think all of us tend to exist pretty inauthentically, and so the suspense in the story is kind of it's a meta suspense, and Wallace is it's pretty typical of Wallace to do writing about you read the book reads you, and I think the idea is if the protagonist of Good Old Neon ends up committing suicide from a life of living the inauthentic self in a very down-to-earth way, what danger are we in ourselves to reaching the same conclusion? So the suspense is a uneasiness that the reader develops about their own life, and they wonder how inauthentic they are living. And the story's pretty down to earth as far as Wallace goes. He's usually pretty guilty of overwriting things, I feel, but Good Old Neon is very simplistic. And while there's some themes of Wittgenstein, I feel, in Good Old Neon, with the idea of, our ability to communicate, specifically in English, is so limited to conveying actual feelings or things that we see, that it's almost like the default setting of human language is fraud and reductionism. And it's a very interesting take, I think. And I think all those books would be worthy of an honorable mention in the pedestal, or on the podium, in the pantheon, forgive me, of suspense writing for short stories. Right now, I'm in the editorial process, and I will butcher the pronunciation of the magazine, but it is a Hawaii-based magazine that I have a short story coming out with. But the editor, who is phenomenal and a very good writer in his own right, is Sam Fletcher. So if any listeners want to Google Sam Fletcher, you'll both find the magazine that I will appear in. It's an ecological magazine. He is a wildlife-friendly writer and is absolutely incredible, and definitely someone to look out for. And hopefully I will be on board with him in the future as well. That would be my shout out, is actually someone else.